All right. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending. I hope you're eager to learn more about the Graceful Exit. This is the conclusion of our three-part series with Fern Hernberg. And if you haven't had the opportunity to see the other two, you can connect with those through my YouTube channel, which is just insurancing with no I, very millennialish. So big N insurancing. Or you can go to my LinkedIn profile because they're there as well. So just search my name. I'm the only Brian Clickener. There's not a lot of Clickeners in the world as it is. So you can find me on LinkedIn, and then in my profile, it'll pull you out to YouTube, and you can see the two previous sessions. Of note, those will be on as well. This will be on those same channels. So just a quick note before we get started, this is a webinar. This webinar is for providing ideas and resources, but not specific guidance or recommendations for you or your unique business situations. Speakers, Fern, in this instance, are generally more than happy to engage with you and your company individually as part of your advising team and with Fern and HR and HR consulting to help provide you tailored recommendations for you and your leadership team. Don't take anything that's being said here as this is what you're supposed to do in every situation. So let's get moving. We've got this scheduled for an hour, a couple minutes in, and you're certainly not here to see me. So this is approved for 1 SHRM credit and 1 HRCI credit. So certificates will be emailed to attendees of this live session this afternoon. Should be this afternoon. If it's not, if I mess up and I don't get them to you tomorrow, trust me, they're coming. I am recording this, as I mentioned earlier, so you'll be able to, there'll be a link most likely in the post email, but you'll also be able to find me through LinkedIn and YouTube. So if you wanted to watch this again, or you felt you wanted to share it with one of your colleagues, that's easy to do. We have Q&A, so you can ask questions as you go. We don't have a chat feature on this, but if you have a question and it requires some context, I can certainly pull you up and allow you to kind of articulate in that, a little more detail. So just quick intro. Again, I said it earlier, but my name is Brian Clickener. I am with Risk Strategies. I've been in the insurance business for over a decade and with some stints in other areas as well, such as government contracting. I was in that space for just shy of 6 years as kind of the Swiss Army knife kind of guy that helped the CEO with a number of different things. So I've been a purchaser of benefits as well as a consumer of benefits. I've been a kind of HR liaison, while not a direct HR consultant or an HR administrator. I've done a lot of these types of roles. We have, as far as our strategy is concerned, we have over 1,800 employees across the country in 70 plus offices. We've been remote, so technically we have like 1,800 offices. And I'll probably be remote, although I am in our new office today, which is pretty exciting. There's 3 of us here in this grand space. I do a lot of webinars as well. This is we're kind of coming to the end of the 2020 season of webinars. I've got one more after this. It's on the CMMC. So if you're at GovCon and you want to know about cybersecurity maturity models, that's coming up in a few weeks. So on to Fern. So Fern Hernberg, she is a human resources executive and entrepreneur with over 20 years experience in both the for-profit and nonprofit sectors. She is also the heart of Eagle HR, her company, which she founded in Vienna, Virginia in 2010. So congratulations on 10 years, Fern.
Thank you.
Quite an accomplishment. Fern's experience includes senior level positions with Blue Cross Blue Shield Association, Deloitte Services LP, and the USO. She holds an undergraduate degree in communications from the University of Delaware. I think the Blue Hens, right?
That's right. Fighting Blue Hens. Thank you very much.
Yes. A Master's of Science of Human Resources from Loyola University in Chicago, and is a graduate of the Nova Dulles Society of Human Resources Management Peer Mentoring Program. She's also a member of SHRM and a certified facilitator and a variety of industry-leading assessments and training programs. With that, I'll pass the mic to Fern.
Thank you very much, Brian, and welcome everybody. Really happy to have you here. As Brian mentioned, this is the 3rd of 3 in a series of webinars that we did throughout the summer leading up to today, and I'm sad to see it end. It's been a lot of fun. So the way we've typically tackled the material is I've got some slides to share. I'll power through those, though feel free, as Brian said, to use the Q&A at any point. But I do try to leave some time at the end for your questions, because I usually find that the most valuable information comes out of the conversation that we have as people share their experiences and their specific questions and concerns. So with that, I'll just kind of dive right into the content. And we'll get going. So we're here to talk about the graceful exit, right? So how we handle employee departures and how to hopefully maintain a positive relationship after people leave your organization. So here's kind of the crux of what we'll cover. We'll talk about the different reasons people leave organizations and what some best practices are for how to handle employee departures. That includes exit interviews. They can be incredibly valuable or incredibly worthless. And so we'll try to give you some tools to make sure they're as valuable as possible. We'll also talk about the impact of departures, not just on the person leaving, but the people being left, right? The people on your team who remain, and how you can kind of get ahead of that. And then we'll talk a little bit about alumni outreach programs, which, a lot of times employers, rightfully so, because we're so busy, right? Somebody leaves, our focus is, okay, as soon as they're gone, they're gone. We got to move on to who takes their place and how business continues and so on. But there's a lot of arguments that support staying connected to people after they leave your organization for a variety of reasons and treating them as valued alumni, just like a lot of colleges and universities and schools do when people leave. So we'll talk about that a little bit and maybe plant some seeds of ideas there before we wrap up. So just to kind of get started with the two primary kinds of separations from an organization, right? There's all the reasons that people choose to leave, and then all the reasons that we choose to ask people to leave. So voluntary and involuntary termination. So let's talk about each for a little bit. So voluntary, the reasons are kind of endless. There's kind of the whole bucket of personal, right? Moving, I want to go back to school, my spouse is relocating, I just had my third kid and it's too hard to work and be at home at the same, or work and take care of them at the same time. All those things, right? A lot of us are taking care of elderly parents right now, and certainly right now, things are more difficult than normal in terms of balancing the home and the family. So all of those personal reasons, and then of course, there's also professional reasons, right? I'm leaving for a better job. I'm leaving because I got offered an opportunity that pays twice as much as you pay, whatever those reasons are. All of those perfectly valid reasons for voluntarily resigning a job. Then on the flip side of that are all the reasons we ask people to leave their job with us. And so, that can be anything from performance issues, which, how you manage those and how you go from first noticing a performance issue to actual terminating employment could be a workshop, should be a workshop in and of itself. So Brian, maybe we'll do that one next, because it's certainly not a quick or easy hop from point A to point B, but oftentimes we wind up there despite our best efforts to improve performance. So sometimes that happens. Sometimes somebody violates rules or standards, or their behavior, not so much their performance, but their conduct or behavior leads us to separating their employment. I tell a story. One of the organizations I used to work for as an employee, I was their HR leader, and I had to terminate somebody because he challenged another employee to a fight in the parking lot. We don't generally put you on a performance plan for that. That's just unacceptable behavior. And so that was an example where we terminated for conduct immediately to get that person out of the organization. And then, of course, there are, sadly, a lot of things we're seeing right now, like reductions in force, furloughs, layoffs, that kind of stuff, where it's really kind of this, through no fault of the employee, the organization just can't support the position anymore. And I also kind of roll under that umbrella what we call restructurings. The organization decides that the way it's going to be set up now, they don't need that assistant controller position anymore. They need a controller and accounting clerk. So your assistant controller all of a sudden doesn't have a position. with the organization. So that would be considered a layoff. So those are, kind of a big bucket view of the different reasons we see people leaving the organization. And obviously the reasons behind the departure are critical in figuring out the right steps to take in kind of out processing them. So I'll speak in some general terms about things to be aware of, and then down the road in the presentation, we'll talk about some specific considerations that you want to keep in mind if, let's say, it's an involuntary termination as opposed to a voluntary one. So some best practices to share, generally speaking, and this is usually for a voluntary resignation, a team send-off can be a great way to say thank you to an employee for their contributions, give people an opportunity to say goodbye and get some closure, and really make the departure as positive a thing as possible. And this is huge. So the way an organization handles the voluntary departure of employees sends a strong message to the remaining employees, because they want to know that if, and they probably will at some point, be in the same boat, right? Very few of us stay at one company for our entire careers. So most of us will be resigning or leaving an organization at some point. They want to know they're going to be treated well. They're going to want to know that their service has been valued and that they're not, quote unquote, dead to you the second that they resign. So how you treat other people when they leave, it tells them a lot about what you might do when they leave. And so it's really important for a variety of reasons to treat people great on their way out and show your appreciation for what they've done while they were there with you. Now, again, obviously things can be a little different if it's an involuntary termination. Generally speaking, for conduct and performance, we would not do this piece. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but certainly there could be situations in a layoff or a restructuring where we do want to say goodbye and thank you in a public way to someone whose position is being eliminated. And again, very situational, but don't rule it out immediately just because it was an involuntary departure, especially if the person's worked there for a really long time, has very deep relationships. It's nice to be able to acknowledge those in a public way. So that's one piece. The rest is, how do we transition work? So you'll always want to make sure that you have a process defined before the person gives their notice, because otherwise you're scrambling, right? So whether it's some sort of exit process or departure checklist or whatever tool you use, make sure that you're accounting for how the tasks of the job are going to be transitioned, how the intellectual knowledge that the departing employee has is going to be transferred to another individual so that we don't lose all of that knowledge and information when they leave. And this could include things like forwarding their, email box to somebody else on the team, or, transition of hard copy files or electronic files, or, information debriefs about client profiles and things like that, just conversations where the person taking over the account meets with the departing employee to get all the information they possibly can from that person's brain before they leave. All of those are really important elements to job and task transfer. Post-employment references should be discussed. So most organizations have some sort of stated policy on how employment will be verified should somebody ever need it, right? So if I'm leaving my company and I'm going to another job, or at some point I want to get a mortgage and I have to list the organization I'm leaving as a prior employer, what can I expect in terms of the experience that that person who's trying to verify my employment is going to have? Will they be able to get all the information that I want the organization to share? Or maybe I don't want the organization to share the information because I've been let go due to performance or conduct. Having a conversation about what information will be shared if somebody reaches out for an employment verification or reference on that person is really important. So there's no missed expectations. So if you don't have a policy, check your employee handbook if you're not sure. I would recommend, first of all, that you route all your requests for employment verifications and references to one individual. If you don't have an HR department, make it someone senior enough in your organization that you have faith that they will handle employment references the appropriate way. And that way you don't have kind of random people saying random things about your departed employees when phone calls come in. You can get yourself in a lot of trouble for that. So happy to answer questions on that, of course, and anything else as we go. Make sure the departing employee knows who to contact if they have questions after they leave. You know, departures are pretty emotional situations. Even if you're voluntarily leaving, a lot of times there's, you know, anxiety or whatever about going in and giving your notice. So, and not to mention when it's an involuntary separation, how emotional and overwhelming that kind of a conversation can be. So we don't want to assume that everybody's going to have the presence of mind enough to ask every single question that they're going to have before their last day. So you want to make sure that they know who to reach out to, how to get, you know, information. What do I do with my 401k? What do I do if I need to take COBRA coverage? You know, how long does that last? How much does it cost? All of those things. You know, even sometimes I just say, look, I'll shoot somebody after a layoff conversation or something. I'll just shoot them an email and I'll say, look, here's all my contact information. Just hang on to this because you're going to have questions. They're going to come up. And so I don't want you to be scrambling for who to call or going through paperwork. Just call me. And that's very helpful, regardless of the reason the person's leaving. Make sure you also have a process in place to retrieve all of your property. So whether that's files and documents or computer equipment, materials, you know, it's right now with everybody, many people working remotely, people have all sorts of equipment and property at their home that might normally be in the office where you could just recollect it. So now when we see separations, voluntary or involuntary, we're seeing a lot of, you know, FedEx shipments back to the office with, you know, return receipt. We're seeing people kind of going on personal errands. You know, you'll send somebody from your office to the departing employee's house to pick up their laptop or whatever the case might be. So want to make sure, again, you have a plan in place to make sure that all of your assets are collected and accounted for. Get updated information so you know how to reach the individual in the future. This is important, of course, for W-2 tax forms that you'll need to send to your employees the following January. But also if they have a pension program or you need to reach them for any other reason, just make sure you not only know when they leave what their current address and phone number and email and contact information is, but you kind of plant that seed with them that if any of that information changes at any point in the future, you need them to update you because it may not occur to them to do so otherwise. Document the departure. This is kind of HR rule of thumb. You just document everything. So whether it was a voluntary termination, you know, in that case, you get a resignation letter or a resignation email or something that you can place in the file that shows that on this date, the person voluntarily resigned their employment. And then you keep copies of every communication that you have with them after that to show that you gave them all that information that they needed, that, you know, they said, I lost my credit card, and so can you just cancel the account? All those things you want to make sure you just have a record of. People forget, people move on. You never know if somebody files an unemployment claim and you want to fight it. It's good to have those kinds of records on hand. You just never know when you might need them. And then another best practice, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in depth, is the exit interview, right? So generally speaking, we usually focus our exit interviews on people who are voluntarily departing the organization. You know, the idea is try to get useful information about the employee's experience so that you can use it to help shape and inform your HR practices and policies going forward, right? To identify problems in the organization or people in the organization who are wonderful coaches and mentors so that you can, you know, kind of reach out to them and thank them for doing that and try to build upon their good behavior. Generally speaking, when someone's leaving involuntarily, it's not a great ideal opportunity to try to get them to share kind of really helpful, useful information. You know, we really want them to be able to focus on their transition and their departure and not kind of ask things from them in terms of that kind of feedback. But again, you know, situational, you never know. There could be a situation where you've got someone who's very, you know, positive about the organization and understanding that their position got eliminated. We're seeing a lot of that actually right now. People get how hard it is for businesses in many cases right now. And so they see it as kind of no fault of the employer if they have to be let go. And they're often very happy to share their thoughts and opinions in a really constructive, productive way. So if you've got a situation like that, great. We always love hearing people's thoughts and experiences. It's really informative. But whether you solicit it or not is pretty situational. So some additional considerations for involuntary separations. You'll want to consider all the things we just talked about, but you may tweak your approach based on the facts of the separation. So again, we talked about this, you know, in certain situations when somebody is leaving, they're a long-term employee, people think really highly of them. Their termination is not contentious. It's not based on conduct or performance. You may still want to have some sort of a farewell happy hour or coffee or lunch or whatever. Most times with involuntary separations, we don't. How and when you communicate the news to the rest of the team. So we see problems around this all the time. People just kind of disappear, right? And employees will come to HR, to, you know, kind of a trusted manager and say, yeah, I had no idea Anita wasn't here anymore. Like, I just sent an email to her and I got a bounce back that she wasn't with the company anymore. Like, when did she leave? Why? What happened? And so a lot of times we're not sure the best way to communicate someone's departure, so we don't communicate anything. And that creates some like really tough feelings in the organization often. So you have to be careful depending, you know, obviously you never want to publicly tell people so-and-so was let go for performance. So-and-so was let go because they challenged somebody to a fight in the parking lot. That's a violation of those people's privacy. But to say something like, I mean, obviously if somebody leaves for a voluntary reason, you can send something out that says, you know, we're so excited for Brian. You know, he found a wonderful opportunity at an organization, you know, that really aligns with his passion for protecting animals from cruelty. And so he's off to do wonderful things there. We wish him all the best. You know, please join us for blah, blah, blah. But when it's involuntary, it's a little trickier. But to not say anything is where the real problem is. So what we would want to say in a case of an involuntary separation is something like, hey team, just want to let you know, Brian's no longer with the organization as of today. And so any emails that you have for him or anything that you may need from him, you know, please contact Susie instead. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to let me know. And that's the extent of your public statement, right? You're not saying anything bad about Brian. You're being very supportive of him. And most importantly, you're making sure that the team is reassured that if they need anything, if they were working with Brian on anything, you'll make sure that there's continuity of support, right? So we are always kind and respectful of the departing employee, regardless of the circumstance. We're communicative so the team knows what's going on. And then if somebody comes to you offline and says, oh my gosh, Brian was here yesterday and gone today, that's so scandalous, something must have happened, what's the deal? All you need to say is, you know, it's really not appropriate for me to talk about the specifics of someone's employment situation. Like, I would never talk about yours with anybody else, and it's not it's not appropriate for me to talk about the details. You know, if you have specific concerns about the work, please know I'm happy to help with any of that. But you know, I want to honor and respect his privacy, and that's it. Security concerns for involuntary separation. So I'll say that my overarching philosophy on this is, I don't think I've personally ever been in the position where I've lost my job on an involuntary basis, but I have been part of far more conversations than I'd wish on my worst enemy. In terms of separation conversations over a 25-year HR career. And I will tell you that it is a horrific experience, I'm sure, for the person who's going through it. And so above anything else, we want people to feel respected and to feel treated as kindly and humanely as possible. So my overarching perspective is unless I have a reason to think that they're going to get angry, get violent, be inappropriate, send an email slamming the company to all our clients, unless I have a reason to think that something bad might happen, I try to be prepared for anything, but go in with a kind, respectful, supportive approach. And part of what that means is that if they, I'm ready, if somebody starts getting angry or worked up and I need to have security come and escort them off the premises, whatever, I've got security on standby. What I don't have is security in the room, because security in the room tells that person I'm expecting them to, right? That I either need protection or the person departing is going to need some sort of control. And I don't want to send that message. Same thing with kind of marching people out of the building, like escorting them out of the building. If you've got a highly valued long-term employee, or at least just somebody who you trust and know is a good human being, and you can kind of hang back and let them, not saying let them have free reign over the office, for 4 hours after you separate them, but if you can kind of hang back and let them pack up their things and have some space and time to themselves, and then just walk them to the elevator. You don't need to walk them out to the parking lot and make sure they leave the premises. Being treated like a criminal feels pretty rotten, especially once you've just lost your job. And so the more we can be kind and supportive of folks, the better. Again, you never want to put your organization or your people at risk. So be prepared for anything, but go into it, I think expecting that that the person's going to certainly be upset, maybe be angry, but will, conduct themselves the right way, unless they give you reason to believe otherwise. How you determine the last day worked and implications for pay, right? So a lot of times when we tell somebody that they're losing their job, that's their last day. Generally speaking, we don't want people to have that information and then kind of stick around, because they're generally not feeling, super positively about the organization or the opportunity. And we don't want any negativity to kind of bleed into the rest of the workplace. There are situations where it's amicable enough and the person is able to kind of keep that professional demeanor, and everybody agrees that they're going to stay through the end of the month to wrap up loose ends. Maybe they do that remotely. Maybe they come into the office 1 day a week instead of 5 days a week, but you want some transition of work. Those are very, situational discussions. You want to consider what's, again, in the best interests of the organization. If somebody does leave abruptly, there is the issue of their belongings. I usually try to offer, again, going into, I just want to make it as easy as, I want to make a painful situation as easy as possible for the person being impacted. So I usually say, you are welcome to stay and put your things, we have a box for you, whatever, if you want to bring them with you. But if you'd rather just go home right now, we are happy to pack up your things. We will ship them to you. We will arrange for someone to meet you here on a Saturday. If you want to come up and pack it up yourself, we'll do that. Again, you just want to be supportive of the employee as much as possible and make sure they get their personal belongings. And then finally, want to consider if you're going to offer severance pay. Now, severance pay, except for very unique circumstances, is generally not required by law. So if you offer severance to a departing employee, and this is, pay kind of in honor of work performed, time with the organization, a couple of things you'll want to keep in mind is, one, you'll want to be as consistent as possible with how you determine whether people get severance pay and how much they get, because you don't want to inadvertently be discriminatory in your practices. So what you don't want over time is to look back and say, hey, 5 people were involuntarily separated last year. you know, 3 were men, 2 were women. We offered severance to all the men, but we didn't offer severance to the women. Well, that wasn't intentional. We'll go with that. Let's say that wasn't intentional. But it can certainly look like a discriminatory practice. So whatever you pick as an approach, you want to make sure it's something that you're comfortable applying consistently in similar situations going forward. The other thing that you'll want to keep in mind is that we really never want to give severance pay without a signed separation agreement, right? So this is one of these like releases of claims you'll want to work with an employment attorney to put together that basically says, you're going to get this severance if you sign this document. And this document says, we're paying everything that we owe you. You've returned everything that you owed us. You're not going to sue us for anything. We're not admitting any wrongdoing. We're agreeing to part amicably, all those things. And so again, you'll have an attorney draw up that paperwork because it's specific to geographic location, and it's also specific to age. There are different requirements, whether you're over 40 or under 40. So you always want to have an attorney work on those for you. But just make sure if you are providing severance pay for an involuntary separation, that you're getting in exchange for that, this signed release of claims from them. That was a lot. And I don't see any questions in the Q&A. So I'm assuming everybody's okay, at least for now. Take a breath. And kind of finish up this train of thought and then go on to some more material. But keep in mind, no matter what prompts the separation, whether it's involuntary or not, you want to ask yourself some questions. So this, of course, relates to involuntary. How surprised will the employee be? Okay. Generally speaking, it's not always avoidable, but generally speaking, we don't want people to be totally surprised and blindsided when they get the news that they're losing their job. Sometimes that's very hard to do in cases of layoff or reduction in force, but certainly in cases of performance, they ought to know through your performance counseling process that their job's on the line and has been on the line because of their performance. Now, if you think somebody's going to be really surprised and may act out because of that surprise, you may want to, for example, have your IT people at the ready to shut down their access if you think they might, react to the separation in shock and send out something unfavorable at some point. But just try to ask yourself that question: Are they going to be shocked? And if they are, kind of be prepared to ease them into it, go into your conversation with that in mind. Are they in a physical situation where they can retreat for a private moment, or are they in a public setting? So this goes back to treating people with respect and care during these difficult conversations. If the only place you have to have this conversation that's kind of in neutral territory is a conference room that's got all glass walls, pull them into your office. Pull them into an empty office down the hall that has a door you can close, so that after you give them the news, if they're upset, you can step out for a few minutes and give them time to pull themselves together. We never want to have an upsetting conversation where people feel like they're on display or they can't have some private moments if they need it. So keep that in mind. Will it be helpful for them to go home for the day after receiving the news? Now, timing, this isn't really in the presentation, but I want to talk about timing of involuntary conversations for a second. A lot of times people say, well, I'll do it Friday at 4:30 in the afternoon because it's the end of the week. And then, I can kind of give them the bad news and send them home for the weekend. And there's a huge school of thought that says that Fridays are the worst day to give somebody this news. And part of the problem is that on a Friday, they generally have a whole weekend to kind of sit and stew and think about things. Now, it's a little different in the age of everything being online, because you can at least go online and start applying for jobs. if you wanted to. But generally speaking, we would want to have the conversation with somebody on a weekday where they could then kind of hopefully wake up the next day kind of with renewed purpose to go try to find something new, make some calls to companies, really reach out when things are active, and they don't have those 2 days of the weekend to kind of dwell on things. The other thing is time of day. I've done some separations where early in my career where they were done towards the end of the day, and the people actually said, and it never would have occurred to me they would have thought this, but obviously I was wrong. They said, wow, you knew you were firing me and you still made me work all day? Like you still, like all day, I've been working, I've been in meetings, you were just trying to get every last drop out of me that you could, knowing that we were having this conversation at the end of the day. And I just remember thinking, even though that wasn't true and that wasn't the intention, that's how they felt. And that was awful. That certainly was not treating them with the respect and humanity that we were hoping to do. And so now I try to schedule terminations for 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, if I can, because then they also have the whole day to just kind of figure out their thoughts and deal with it. And they don't have to, or transition work, but what they don't have to do is have that feeling that they were used for just to squeeze another day out of work from them. And then when you tell them, obviously, especially if they're staying for a little while to transition, if you're asking them to, work through the end of the month, or sometimes we have people work until a replacement is hired, let them go home. Especially if they're upset, they're probably going to want to go home. Take the rest of the day. Just go home, take care of yourself, digest all of this, think of any questions that you have. Come back tomorrow. We'll start working on your transition. But there's certainly no need for you to stick it out for the rest of the day today. That's just a humane thing to do. Consider what relationships people have with others in the office. If you are doing an involuntary separation and you want them out of the office pretty quickly because you're afraid it will be disruptive, make sure you provide them an opportunity to say goodbye to their friends. Maybe say, we know that, you've been here for a long time. You have really great relationships. We were thinking about having a happy hour for you at the end of the week so that, people could come and you could say goodbyes. How does that feel? Would you like that? Or would you like to just reach out to them on your own after you leave? But acknowledge it and give them the opportunity to have closure for those relationships. Consider, we talked about this a little bit in the planning stage, how will this affect colleagues with whom the person works closely, like their workload? A lot of times we know that there's going to be a gap to fill, but we don't necessarily think about the people who are going to be filling that gap in addition to their normal jobs until we can get somebody else in the door. So we want to be careful about that. And then consider, whether or not, who's having the conversation, right? So you'll want to talk with your HR advisor or consultant about the appropriate person, whether it's the person's direct manager or a leader of the organization who's having separation conversations with folks. General rule of thumb is anytime you're having a separation conversation, you want at least 3 people in the room, the person being impacted, person having the conversation or leading the conversation, and then someone who's there as a witness. They're not sitting there with a witness name tag on them, but that's, really practically speaking, the purpose of their presence so that, no party can go back and say, well, you said this in our separation conversation, right? You want somebody who ideally can also help answer questions and help facilitate the employee's departure. But most importantly, that they're there as kind of another set of eyes and ears to what's being said. So let's move on for a second to exit interviews. So we've had the conversation or the person's resigned, whether it's voluntary or involuntary. We know the person's leaving. So now we decide whether we want to conduct an exit interview with them. And as I mentioned before, you kind of got to gauge the situation. If someone's really bitter about the organization, probably not the person you want to tap for an exit interview. Now, I will say, if they're leaving voluntarily and they're bitter about the organization, they may be the perfect person to tap for an exit interview. So, I mean, again, involuntary, you got to evaluate the situation and decide if it makes sense. Voluntary departures, I would always, regardless of, even if you are 100% sure of what you're going to hear, I would still have that exit conversation, because I think you can learn so much from people on their way out of an organization. So generally, exit interviews would be held by some objective third party, right? So I'm not a fan at all of having people meet with their managers for an exit interview. Now, that's not to say that the manager shouldn't reach out and say, gosh, as you're leaving, you know, is there anything you can tell me about my management style or how things could have been better for you? That's a great conversation to have. But the formal exit interview ought to be with someone who's seen as more objective, where the person can really come and talk about that manager or talk about other experiences without any fear of, you know, impunity or retribution or anything like that. Come up with questions, right? That, I mean, and there's tons of examples out there that you could, you know, just Google exit interview questions and you can get a million and see which ones you like. But generally, I try to focus on, you know, kind of the employee experience from start to finish. I generally start with, you know, is the job what you expected it to be? Like when we first met with you and we said, this is what we're offering, did we follow through? You know, was that really what your experience was? Because that can tell you a lot about your recruiting process. You know, it can tell you whether your interviewers are providing a realistic preview of the opportunity to folks, right? Ask how onboarding and orientation was. Did you feel like you were part of the team right out of the gates? You know, what did or didn't make you feel that way? And then go all the way through, right? Their departure, what's causing them to leave, who was a terrific mentor to them while they were there. Because again, that's really, you know, a lot of times exit interviews are focused on negative stuff. What could we have done to retain you? You know, were you dissatisfied with your compensation? I like to use the opportunity to also find out, like, who are the great champions of the organization that we have out there? Who are the wonderful managers? Who are the people who we can look to and say, how do we get more of those behaviors in the rest of the organization? Because they're really, you know, making a difference in our people. So, you know, make sure that you have a nice list of questions, that they're varied. I always try to do them in person rather than by writing. A lot of times people send like an electronic survey. It's probably quicker, but I think that you get a much richer answer when you're talking with someone, and it also allows you to kind of probe and ask follow-up questions. From a timing perspective, we usually try to do the exit interview before people leave the office for their last day, only because they want to, and we want to allow them to shift their focus to what's ahead once they leave the organization. That said, I have heard of some success stories where organizations will follow up with departed employees a couple months after they leave. And they get limited response, but the response they get can be really interesting. So what they'll do is they'll reach out to someone and they'll say, you know, hey, Bob, you know, it's now been 2 months since you left us, and we hope everything's going great for you. We just wanted to check in because now that it's been a couple months, we're wondering kind of how you're looking back on your time with us. And if there's anything new or different from what you shared during your exit interview that would be helpful for us to know as we kind of look after the other employees who are here. And a lot of times when people have a little distance and a little perspective, they see things a slightly different way. And so lots of organizations find that to be valuable information. I say go for it if you think it might be helpful, but at minimum, try to catch people before they leave. And Brian, you make the deck available, correct, afterwards for everybody?
Yeah, I'll share it in the post-webinar email for sure.
Wonderful. So thank you. So, you know, I just listed some sample questions. Again, there's a million out there. And the bottom line is just whatever you're curious about, ask. They can always say, I'm not comfortable answering that. But I'd let you know, I think anybody in a leadership organization or an HR position is probably pretty curious about some very specific things in their company. How did you feel about, the new benefit plan we launched last year? Was that a factor in you leaving? Like, ask what you're interested in, and try to get good information from it. So whether voluntary or involuntary, employee separations can and do create hard feelings, right? So let's look at it from both perspectives. So the departing employee who voluntarily is resigning, right? I had a really interesting experience with this very early in my career. I was probably 27 or so. And it was really my first job. I got the job while I was in grad school. So, I was pretty young. And I had kind of worked my way up through several different roles. But ultimately, I felt kind of pigeonholed as a really junior employee. And I went ahead and I had gotten my master's. I had worked for several years. But I was really feeling like I couldn't grow the way I wanted to in my career at that organization, because I felt like they were always going to see me as the young 20s, first job kind of person. And so it was a really hard decision, but I went to the leader, who was the VP of HR, and resigned. And I was anxious about it and upset. And it was probably the first job I'd ever really quit. And it was hard for me. Well, this gentleman, who was, I guess, in his 50s at the time, VP of a pretty large nonprofit organization that everybody would recognize the name of, was so personally upset and offended and felt I was so ungrateful for the opportunities he had given me that he didn't talk to me for a week in a professional environment. And this is not an unusual story from what I hear from people. He took it as a personal affront, right?
Yeah, I totally had a similar, I don't want to make it about me, but I had a similar type of experience with, and one of the senior execs, I was persona non grata for my transition out.
It is unbelievable, isn't it? And it's, and I don't know, like, eventually for me, it's kind of a long story, but eventually for me, he got over it. After about a week, he got over it. He started talking to me again, which sounded so like sixth grade to even say it. But he started talking to me again. And by the time my notice period had run out, we were kind of back on our warm, cordial terms. And eventually, about 3 or 4 years later, I wound up coming back to that organization and stayed for another 4 years in a different capacity. So, but the bottom line of that story, and I think Brian's too, is that these are highly emotional situations. It's not all business, even though maybe it should be. And so people can feel abandoned. People can feel like you're being ungrateful for what you've done for them. People can feel dumped on from a work perspective. You just never know. And again, I'm just talking about the voluntary ones right now. I think it's really important that as a manager, you kind of acknowledge that these feelings can happen, and do your best to, in spite of them, kind of maintain a really positive professional relationship with the departing employee. Number one is, again, as met with many things, it sends a message to the people who remain as far as how you're going to react if they ever leave. But the longer I'm in the working world, the more I appreciate the importance of relationships. And when you've worked with somebody long enough or deeply enough so that you actually do have a feeling of confusion or bitterness or sadness about them leaving, that tells me that's a relationship that's worth preserving. And you don't want to ruin, the relationship that you've built because of your reaction. So I usually suggest, acknowledge it and then take some time and say, Brian, I got to say, I am so sorry to see you go. And I'm feeling selfishly like I'm hurting right now over that. And I'm shocked. I wasn't expecting it. Just give me some time. I'll get there. I'm happy for you and whatever this means for you. And let's reconnect tomorrow so we can talk about transition or whatever like that. And then, you know, shield them from that emotion that you're feeling to some extent, especially if it's going to do damage to the relationship. And I think it's, you know, you can extrapolate that to team members, right? So everybody who was working with this person may be thinking, wow, I'm going to miss them. How could they leave me? Great, now I have to do all their work. All of those emotions can come into play and start seeping into the relationship. So, you know, awareness and just taking proactive efforts to manage those situations will go a long way in these situations. And it leads to kind of the final point of the program, which is about alumni programs, right? So, you know, there are so many benefits for staying in touch with former employees. And I never truly appreciated this until I worked for a professional consulting firm, one of the big four, that really valued its alumni. And one of the lessons they taught me earlier in my career was that, you know, you never know down the road. And this, I mean, this sounds a little self-serving, but I think you'll follow where I'm going with this. You'll never know down the road how those relationships may come back into play. So a former employee could be a boomerang, right? Someone who comes back to work for your organization down the road if they feel positively about you, like I did with that nonprofit, right? They could be a potential client themselves. They could be a source for other employees. Well, you know, I wound up leaving that organization, but they were a great place to work and you should go apply. Let me connect you with my former manager. They could just be somebody in your network, you know, that you enjoy and you can reach out to and stay connected with and share, you know, a nice hello from time to time. I still have people in my network from 20 years ago. We're just on LinkedIn together, right? But every now and then we pop in and check on each other and it's just nice to have those connections. So for all those reasons, you know, this is a step a lot of organizations skip. When somebody works their last day, they're gone. Right? You move on to the new person coming in and absolutely you need to focus energies on those folks. But, you know, my argument is don't do it at the expense of keeping in touch with your alumni because your alumni are a really, really wonderful group of people to stay close to. So you can do this in a variety of ways. I mean, back when we are back in person with each other, a really popular way to do this is like alumni happy hours, or you invite them to the annual company picnic. You know, anybody who is an alumni from the past 2 years, you invite them and their families to the company picnic. Maybe you have an alumni newsletter where you keep them posted on what's going on in the organization, all sorts of stuff, right? These days, a lot of organizations are doing community service, days of community service. And that's another great way to tie your alumni in and invite them to participate along with your active employees. So again, just, you know, with everything we have to do, it may not be top priority, but if you think about just in general, how you maintain your relationships with folks leaving, making sure it's positive and professional, that's a great place to be. So that was a lot of information. I know I've been talking for a long time. Let me pause there. I see we've got maybe one question in Q&A. Let me.
I think, so I can maybe generalize some of this. So looking at this, so it's small organization, maybe small team, right? With kind of, they're somewhat close knit. There's an individual inside of this group that has some very strong personal relationships with a couple of people that are important to the functioning of this team. But there's also some negative stuff that this person brings. It looks like there's a lot of maybe just things that are said, actions that are said or taken that have been documented as negative, but it still kind of continues. And so like, how do we manage, you know, the process, and what happens if we make the decision to ultimately, you know, make the involuntary termination if we don't see improvement, is really, I guess, where the question is going.
Yeah. Oh, it's such a good question, and it's such a tough situation. So, and I see that the person who submitted this has said that they're happy to engage offline as well. And I do think, Brian, to the extent you want to send my email out as well, I'm happy to. Whoever submitted this, please do feel free to reach out. I'll say in general, my main piece of advice would be, and I'm not sure. I know the issues have been documented. I couldn't tell from the write up there how much it's been discussed with we'll call them the problem employee, but the employee who's demonstrating the negative behavior. And we would want to make sure that we had sat down and explained what the ramifications were of the negative behavior on the rest of the organization, but also made it very clear that if the negative behavior didn't stop, right, very specifically, what could potentially happen with this person's employment. So again, this goes back to the counseling process. We'd want to make sure that that was really carefully handled. And then if they continue to have issues and persist, then yeah, I think we would be talking about potential termination. And then we would talk about messaging for the rest of the team. Because at the end of the day, it's really unfortunate when an organization is held hostage by, we'll call it a bad actor, because either they hold information that the organization needs or they have relationships that are vital to the organization. And we really don't want people to go ahead and be able to act in ways that don't support the culture that we want, simply because they've positioned themselves well. So I think if you've determined that there's behavior that's not acceptable, you got to move on it and just do it in a really careful way. So please do reach out to me. We can talk about the specifics of the situation and where you might want to go from here.
Thank you for that. One thing that kind of popped up as you were going through this, because there's kind of maybe some traditional work environments where, we all come into an office or a virtual office, whatever that is, and ultimately you're in a company-defined space. And this is probably too long for the 3 minutes that we have left, but I go back to my own personal experience as a government contractor. Yeah. Quickly and early on in my first probably several months there in this kind of role that had a lot of different things that I did, I recognized that the process for involuntary termination of a member of our team, that maybe it wasn't performance-based, it was just that the contract ended. Mm-hmm. Right, and so the government customer made their decision for whatever reason, and they're not obligated to tell us why. They're just obligated to tell us we don't want this person here. And I know they're not personal services contracts, but when the government customer says I don't like Jim or Sally or whomever, you're kind of obligated to make that happen. So I quickly figured out that that experience for that employee, number one, it's the worst day that employee is going to have probably that year. Yep. So don't make it about you, make it about them. And also kind of a defining principle as I took over that role is like, well, culture isn't just what's inside the house. Culture is also curb appeal from the outside, right? And when people leave that house and they're walking out, are they seeing a bunch of broken windows and, weeds everywhere or not? And ultimately,
great analogy.
Things like, whether it's Glassdoor or Twitter or whatever the mechanism, employees have great opportunities, ex-employees have great opportunities to voice their dissatisfaction. Mm-hmm. And they have huge megaphones. They can reach thousands of people. And so it's just, I always look at it from like an empathetic point of view, like how can I help make this 20 minutes or this 30 minutes or whatever long it takes for me to make sure this person is fine? How can I help them get through what's going to be their worst time and make it not about me? It's not this isn't hard on me, yeah. Although it is, right? It's like the worst experience. you've done it before. It's the worst experience.
That's awful. Yeah.
But it's not about you. It's about this person and the crappy day that they're about to have. That was always my guiding principle in trying to manage that experience.
Yeah. Brian, I think that's an excellent point. And it's funny, I have a thing, I can't sleep. I never can sleep the night before a separation conversation, even if it's like this person was like lying on their timesheets. To lose the job, I can't even imagine, right? And especially when it's a no fault, right? Like it's just good people lose their jobs every day. Sometimes it's because they're trying really hard, but they just can't get the job right. And sometimes it's through a reduction in force, but it's awful. And so I've always said, I never want to be able to sleep the night before, because I always want to remember how much harder it is for them than it is for me, even though those days are days when I just want to kind of curl up in the fetal position under my desk afterwards. And that's after 25
Yep.
years. So I really appreciate those comments. It's important to keep that in mind. And I've had people, by the way, just one thing that I didn't really talk about specifically, but before we leave, I want to make sure I make the suggestion. When you are having an involuntary separation conversation with someone, I cannot emphasize enough the importance of putting together some talking points beforehand, not a script. You don't want to be sitting there kind of reading a script, but you do want to make sure that you do say certain things and you don't say other things. If you have people who walked in and said, I know this is really hard to hear, it's really hard for me to say. There's,
that's exactly the point, yeah.
You mean well. And there's a way to say that and be supportive and empathetic without kind of making it about you and all that. So again, an HR consultant can help you with what those words are, how you want to message the decision that's been made in a way that's, as kind and supportive to the employee as possible. So I just want to make sure I got that in before we left.
Yeah, one last question not related to that, but it always goes back. I made a note to myself about reference, and what you may be referencing when an employee calls into human resources. And you laid out kind of three things like job title, time that they were there, and salary. Are you seeing that the salary is like more often than not being communicated when people are calling in for references? Is that a trend? I thought I had heard this from talking with other kind of HR professionals that they're sticking to the dates of service and what the person's kind of title was.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So a lot of this is coming because there have been laws that have been passed recently at the state level regarding what can and can't be asked as part of the interview process. And out of concern for equal pay issues, several states have said you're no longer allowed to ask what people are currently making because that's irrelevant. It doesn't take into account the fact that they may be inappropriately paid right now. Right. And so what they're encouraging employers to ask is, what are your salary requirements? Or, what do you, what's a ballpark of where you'd like to be for this role? As opposed to trying to verify salary. Now, where we're still seeing a lot of salary verification requests are for things like mortgages, where income verification is a key part of what they need, much less in the employment landscape. But, check the requirements for your state as to whether you're still even allowed to ask for it. If you are, then you can decide by policy whether you want to provide that information or not.
Well, we're 3 minutes into overtime, and I'm sure that we could probably there's more things to talk about, because I had other notes as well, but I won't drone on like I'm apt to do. So I don't see any other questions. And so with that, we're just over an hour. So I just as a note, I am hosting a webinar if you're a GovCon on the CMMC foundations and how to prepare for it. That is on the 13th, but you'll get an invite for that if you're on this. So I want to thank you all for your attendance and engagement. And Fern, thanks for a really interesting and educational and fun 3 sessions. We really appreciate your energy, enthusiasm, and your expertise. So thanks a lot for that.
My pleasure. Thank you
so much.
I'll
leave the last word to you. Okay.
Yeah, no, it was absolutely my pleasure. Thank you guys so much for joining. And as Brian said, he's going to send out my contact info. Don't hesitate. If you have any questions or very specific things you want to talk about, I'm happy to help. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, Fern. Have a great day, everyone.